1, 1, 2.
Kristen, so we'll fill up to the podium during our presentation after the fireside chat. We'll do the podium and sit down.
Yeah, I think that makes most sense. I mean, so people can see the slides, and then we're going to do breakout sessions. We're not going to go straight into Q&A. We're going to do the breakout sessions, and then Q&A and discussion, and then we'll bring all of you back up for Q&A and discussion. But I think the podium, so it's just easier for people to see, and
I don't know.
I suppose if you want to sit next, as long as you're not blocking the view.
No,
However you're comfortable.
Can we control slides from there, or do we always have to? Oh, okay.
Controlling slide to myself.
Okay.
And what's your name?
Josh.
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 So you just have to cue Josh.
Okay.
All right.
My slides will.
Other logistics issues?
Did you say you want Dicta and me to come up also at the end for the Q&A?
Yeah.
Just, Okay.
Yeah, we'll have all of you, and we'll have Albert on the screen.
Can everybody hear me? Oh, it's on. That's great.
Yeah, not online yet.
I think we are. Welcome, everyone, to our session on resilience and conflict. I'm Christine Gottschalk. I'm the director of the Center for Resilience in USAID. And since we are starting a few minutes late, I'm going to keep the kind of opening for this session pretty short. We also have some really great speakers to hear from. What we're going to do in this session, we're going to start with a fireside chat, and then we're going to move to 3 different presentations showing some research findings, the practical application of research findings in this space, and also some mapping of evidence in this space. From there, we're going to move into some breakout groups where you all are going to think about questions you want to ask from all of our panelists. We'll bring everybody back up at the end for some Q&A and discussion. I've met many of you in the room, but not all of you, and I know that you all have some really deep and rich experience as well. So we really invite you all to also share examples and really dig into to make the discussion really rich. So just to frame this discussion, for when we think about resilience and conflict, they're both 2 approaches. The way we think about both really needs to be integrated into the work we do, whether that's our humanitarian work, our development work. And for USAID, we have been integrating conflict in a couple different ways. One, at a very high level, into our guiding policies. And that's really important because it guides what we are supposed to work on. So it may not be the sexiest sounding thing, but it is really important that at a high level, it is well integrated into USAID's new policy framework and into our major other strategies, whether that's the global water strategy, our global food security strategy, our health strategies, our resilience policy. And then another way we integrate conflict is by including a really specific goal, sometimes around conflict integration. That's the case in the global food security strategy. And we have really learned a lot in recent years just about the important connections between conflict and food systems, and that feedback loop between the 2, which can be both positive and negative. And then I also just wanted to note that another way we kind of tackle integrating conflict is through specific goals around humanitarian development and peace coherence. And the humanitarian development peace nexus, if you want to call it that. I don't particularly like the nexus term. But that, as well as resilience and conflict sensitivity, they're really about returning to the problem and really looking at very context-driven instead of sector-driven work. And I think that's an important piece that we'll see come out in the discussions today about that relationship between really context-driven work that's important to both conflict sensitivity and resilience. And then lastly, as I know all of you know very well, whether you're addressing health, food, water security, we are increasingly in conflict-affected places. And we really just are not going to meet our goals if we're not really thinking thoughtfully about how we address vulnerabilities, how we address this feedback loop, and how we really use moments of opportunity to help expand peace in areas and kind of lay the ground for recovery. So with that, I would like to call up my first 2 speakers. Jen Abdella is the Vice President of Technical Leadership with the Near East Foundation. And Jen works closely with NEF's global program and business development teams to support program growth, while also furthering NEF's technical leadership and ensuring the alignment of new programs. She provides strategic and direction on development, program design, partnership building, resource mobilization, and she provides support on climate resilience, adaptation finance, sustainable agriculture, and natural resource management, including support for the green economy, and looking at these pieces within fragile and conflict-affected settings. And next, I'd like to bring up Dikta Ogisi. Dikta is a professor of agricultural economics with Delta State University in Nigeria. And she is also the Dean of Faculty of Agriculture and the past Dean of the Postgraduate School of Delta State University, and is a principal researcher and investigator with the Center for Population and Environment Development. Dikta has been involved in teaching, research, mentorship, training on various aspects that cover resilient and fragile economies, impact assessment, rural development, women as key leaders, and resilience and food security, also as they relate to climate change and climate justice, and particularly in conflict-affected areas. So thank you both, and welcome. I wanted to start off just by asking both of you if you could share a little bit about how you have applied a resilience approach and lens to your work in conflict-affected settings. Pass the mic first to Jen and grab another mic.
Thank you, Christine. And thanks to everyone for choosing our session. Hopefully we'll unlock lots of great information about fragile and conflict-affected contexts. For the Near East Foundation, I was just talking with someone at lunch. I think 7 of the 9 countries we work in are fragile and conflict-affected. When we think about working in those spaces, we've heard yesterday and today about responding to multidimensional risks and overlapping risks. So climate change, conflict, political instability, financial crises, you name it. And all of those materialize in the places that where we work. People don't experience these risks, as we all know, in silos. And so we try very hard to make our programs responsive to the way those risks materialize for the communities where we work. Christine mentioned context, and context drives what these programs look like in each place. And I thought I'd share a little bit about our work in Mali and in Syria, which are 2 very different contexts, but where we see climate change and conflict and other crises playing out and really undermining people's progress towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So in each case, the Near East Foundation takes a systems approach, whether we're talking about market systems, natural resources systems, governance systems, social systems, financial systems. And many times we're working across multiple systems because that kind of holistic approach is what's required. I do want to give a nod to the fact that I am here speaking to you today, but we're able to do the work that we do because we have incredible colleagues in Mali and in Syria and in Jordan who are making these programs happen and who have deep, deep contextual knowledge and deep, deep relationships with the places where we work. So I'm kind of the mouthpiece, but this is really, I'm bragging on their work, if you'll allow me to brag on their work. In Mali, this is a place that is affected by, we work in central Mali in the Mopti region. The Near East Foundation has been there continuously since 1984. In 2012, there was a coup, an occupation by ISIS and jihadist rebels. There's been ongoing instability since prior to that, and since then, there's also resource-related conflicts, there's scarcity, there's drought, development deficits. The Near East Foundation has developed a program that's really targeting building resilience for the purposes of achieving food security, going to your food systems relationship, and also reducing poverty. But recognizing that the risks presented by climate change and by conflict affect progress towards those goals. In that context, in MOPD, our programming is using collaboration around natural resources management and governance and economic development to advance social cohesion and relationship building within those communities. Mali has incredibly strong social networks and relationships as a baseline. In some cases, those relationships and trust have been eroded by the conflict, by change within those communities, by migration, et cetera. So the Near East Foundation is doing a lot of different interventions. This is a program that's been going on since 2012 with the funding of the Dutch government, working on developing local land use conventions to negotiate shared resources, investing in shared resources such as livestock corridors, water points, and also economic resources such as post-harvest storage units for shallots or grains that help not only advance food security, advance economic development, but also protect against climate shocks. Alongside, we're working on agricultural value chain development. There's an access to finance component through a local microfinance institution that we helped create, but that is now independent. And also some very intensive and intentional capacity building at the local level around conflict management. So we've created groups of citizens that were nominated by their peers who help negotiate and navigate local conflict when it arises. These groups, we call them learning and dialogue groups. They also facilitate dialogue with local governments. And I should say that in this context, the local government at both the commune and CERC level, but also at the regional level in Mali, are partners in this programming. So we're not creating parallel systems, we're reinforcing governance systems that exist in those contexts. But the idea across all of the programming really is advancing the interests that folks have in their own development in a way that is inclusive and cooperative and can help rebuild trust. And we see that the governance institutions that we're helping to create help mitigate and minimize risks of conflict. They help contribute to more sustainable resource use and also restoration. So communities are restoring forests, they're restoring wetlands that are critically important resources across livelihoods groups. And then really quickly, if I can say, in Syria, a totally different context, but also conflict affected and climate impacted. Our work there is much more narrow. So it's not so many different systems, but there's no financial system. Northeast Syria is unbanked. There are no financial regulations, and there's no access to credit. So we found that micro enterprises, agriculture communities couldn't access the capital they needed on the seasonal basis that they needed to reinvest and recover livelihoods. The Near East Foundation has created revolving loan funds that have issued loans at this point to about 3,000 people, several $1 million worth of lending, with specialized loans now for agriculture, tailored to seasonality, and tailored to allow for those upfront capital investments in things like greenhouses or irrigation systems or improved seeds that can help advance agricultural recovery in the context of climate change, but also that can help minimize some of the competition between MSMEs. And we're looking now at adding a dispute resolution component to the MSME work.
Thank you. And Dikta, as a lead researcher, you work really closely with local communities. Could you share with us, just to start off, a little of what you see as some of the drivers of conflict and some of the approaches that work in starting to address some of those drivers? Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Yes, I want to say that the work we are doing is in the Sahel region, and we are working in Nigeria, northeast Nigeria, covering a few states, and also southern Sudan. The people working in southern Sudan are from Kenyatta University. Professor Joy is the PI of that team, while we work together and we always compare notes. And these are under the sponsorship of SPARC, which is supporting pastoralism and agriculture in recurrent and protracted crisis. And we are looking at how the pastoralism and agriculture participants or those involved in this can actually have meaningful livelihood and can bounce back better. Talking about the conflicts in the Sahel, especially in northeast Nigeria, it's real. And there are conflicts between the pastoralists and the crop farmers, what we call the herder-farmer conflicts. And the cause of that conflict is the access to land, the grain, and as well as water. Because the Sahel is a region that has acute shortage of water. And so there is usually crisis when there is shared or common resources. The crisis is also, we also have other issues that are other drivers of crisis or conflicts. And one of them is religious conflicts between Christians and Muslims who used to dwell together, but all of a sudden there's somehow mistrust or distrust. And then there is also crisis between the people, the communities, and the government. Perhaps because communities have come to think that government is not able to protect them. We have the issue of Boko Haram, which is a military kind of crisis that we would have heard how Boko Haram took some female students from a boarding school. And this has gone on for some years. Some of them have been recovered, but some have not been able to be found. Then the crisis in southern Sudan, for instance, is also very real, that even the team that was to go to study there, we had to, resilience on the part of the research team had to go through the Catholic mission, because just going into Sudan, southern Sudan, because of the war that we are aware of, it was not easy, but they had to go through the Catholic Church in Kenya versus the Catholic Church in Sudan. So they are using the Catholic Church as an entry point rather than entering as pure researchers. So that is the reality of the conflicts. And like I said, one of the things that have come out clearly is that there is a mistrust, and the local communities have decided to put up various ways to police themselves, like having vigilantes and other setup that can take care of them in times of breakdown. And then when you look at the farmer-herder conflict, the herders have the cattle, and the cattle it's not the traditional or the Western way of having pastures and well-marked areas or farms. But the cattle rearers are looking for grass that they did not plant. So it's like they are looking for grass in the wild, the one that is common to everyone. So when they move around, that movement might infringe on a crop farmer. And the crop farmer would now look for a solution to prevent them from coming. So they have devised many methods, like digging around their farms, you know, because the cattle, if they fall into a ditch, they are not likely to be able to come out. So the cattle rearer would be watching out for such traps to prevent them from entering into a farmer's field. So this crisis, there are many ways. The cattle farmer has also found ways. Instead of having a free-range land, they have decided to own either outright purchase of land from communities. When land is purchased by the cattle rearers, then it's like it belongs to them. But the challenge there is that because the land that the cattle needs to graze is usually quite large, they are not able to put demarcations or fences for the cattle to know that this is the boundary. So even when the rearers have bought the land, there is still this free ranging that might still infringe on the part of the crop farmer. So these are some of the challenges. But as we worked in these communities, which we have been doing for some time, under the sponsorship of SPARC, Co-Water, and ODI, we have been able to find that water is an issue. And so we have tried to suggest, after interaction and hearing the voices of the pastoralist and hearing the voices of the farmer, no blame here, no blame there, because everyone have their reasons for conflict, which to us, they are all legit and very important. But what we have tried to do is to try to interact and ask questions. If there is a way water can be provided to the animals without having to graze across the cassava field or rice field or grain fields. This is receiving good attention, but like every good innovation will require another level of funding, which is our project intend to take this study further by bringing innovative, more resilient and more peaceful coexistence between the herders and the crop farmers on the one hand. And this we have done by listening and hearing both sides. And then we also have issues of conflict, even within households. For instance, some of the men, the pastoralists, they have more than one wife, and because it's allowed in one of the religions. And so we see that some of the women now feel that they have to depend on their husbands, who is the pastoralist. But when we interacted with the women in safe place, because they cannot really interact with the research team so easily. But when we interacted, we found that they would consider some financial independence and also being more involved in decision making for themselves, for their children, and even more involvement in the cattle business. Then some of them have said they are prepared to do other things, like raising a smaller ruminants like goats and sheep, which is easier for the women to do around the homestead, and then also perhaps to do trading and a little bit more agriculture under irrigation because of the arid nature, the Sahel nature. So these are some of the things we are hearing, and we know that as we continue to listen to their voices, we are going close to solution, because the crisis has made Nigeria team move faster than the Southern Sudan team, because entry was a challenge. So we are listening to both sides, and we know that we have also involved policy, that we've involved the policy makers. So we are sure that by the time we come with our final feedback to the communities, which we will do, the policy makers will be there and will be able to make a policy statement, which we hope will be taken as a policy brief for the government to take action.
All right,
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So both of you brought up trust building in these examples. Dikta, thank you very much for also just bringing up some of the challenges around the teams that are working in these areas and their own protection. I think we will be bringing both Jen and Dikta back up after we have 3 other panel presentations. Do we have time for a couple questions now? No, okay. All right, so we're going to catch up on time. But Jen and Dikta are going to be back up, and I would love to just pull on a couple things that you both mentioned. One, hearing more about the strategies you've seen that work around trust building, and also the role of women. Dikta, you started to share a little bit about income generating for women and the role of women, not just in the community and the household and what they're seeking, but also as peacemakers. That would be really great to hear more from. All right, so we're going to shift gears. Yes. Thank you. I'm all of it. All right, so we're going to shift gears and do we have Albert up online? Thanks, Dikta. All right, and we've got Albert online. And are we starting? We're starting with Miriam, right? All right. So Miriam is the senior research is a senior research associate at 3IE. She leads and supports the production of systematic reviews and evidence gap maps on the effectiveness of interventions, addressing various development issues such as climate change and resilience, as well as the role of civil society, media work, and health. Her work focuses on research mitigating the effects of the climate crisis in low and middle income countries. And Miriam, I'm going to go ahead and hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. Can we have the slide? Okay, thank you. Right, so yeah, thank you for being here today. I'm going to present an evidence gap map that focused on strengthening resilience against shock and stressor in recurring crises in low and middle income countries. I'm here today representing the team. Is here also present Caroline Huang, who was the project lead. And just to give you a brief background on 3IE, this is our international no-profit NGO where we do mostly research on evidence-based. So next, and next again. First of all, I just want to give a few words on what is an evidence gap map. It is a knowledge management tool where we map, in this case, impact evaluation and systematic reviews that look at certain interventions and outcomes. It is basically used to identify the main evidence gaps and synthesis gaps, and also understand which are the lessons from the high and medium confidence systematic reviews. It is really useful for researchers to understand where the evidence is missing, and also for commissioner and policymakers to easily access research. In this map, we have identified a total of 362 studies. Next. So, yeah, next and next. The scope of this EGM was really looking at interventions that aim to increase resilience, and we have adopted the definition by USAID. Yeah, next, a few times, please. so the interventions we look at range across various sectors because, as you know, resilience is multi-sectorial, so we look at things like financial inclusion, early warning system, nature-based solutions, governance, and many others. And we build that on the pragmatic approach provided by the USAID Resilience Bureau, as well as reference to the literature. The outcomes were mainly based on, again, the strategic approaches provided by RFS, but also the framework developed by Chris Benet on resilience, which looks at resilience as the three capacities: absorptive, adaptive, and transformative. Next, please. And you can access then the map online, of course. We'll provide the link. So, yeah. In terms of the findings, we look at studies implemented in shocks and stressors implemented in many different settings. So we look at both climate change effects, but also conflicts. And I will now present the results only for the conflict studies, but which are 101. So around a third of the total studies, but just to let you know that we have many more studies in the EGM. Next. So one of the main findings is that most of the interventions were multi-component, which reminds me what Jane just said about holistic approach, right? Where we use a lot of components, the intervention group received a lot of different interventions, which might be cash transfer in the early warning system and some technical assistance, and then we look at the results. Although we also noticed that these multi-components interventions were really diverse, we were not able to analyze, to identify trends in the kind of components that were put together. And this is an issue from one side because it's difficult to then understand which is the combination that really works. And on the other side, we understand that it's probably because each context is very different, so each intervention needs to be adapted. The second most studied intervention for the conflict studies are the psychosocial interventions. Next. Although one of the other main finding of the whole EGM, not only for conflict study, is that most of the other interventions don't have just a few or no studies, which means that we have numerous big knowledge gaps that will need to be filled in the next years. Next, please. So if we look at the outcomes, most of the outcomes of the conflict studies look at what they fall under the income and gender and equity inclusion outcomes. And 23 studies in this case look at income, savings, and asset ownership, and 10 look at labor productivity. But again, next. Again, many of the outcomes were not reported by any or very few studies. And something interesting is that, for example, across the whole map, numerous studies look at the measures of diversified income sources or use of coping strategies. But in the case of the conflict studies, we didn't observe many of them, which is, I think, a very interesting findings to think about in the future. Next, please. So, as I was saying, we have also included systematic reviews in the map, and systematic reviews are reviews where the literature is systematically searched and studied. As we did for the map, we systematically searched, studied in academic and grey literature databases. We usually look at the confidence level in the results of the systematic reviews, and in this case, many of the systematic reviews were rated as low, and only 7 were high confidence or medium. Next, please. So, in terms of systematic reviews that also look at studies in conflict settings, we found that conditional and unconditional cash transfers seems to have a positive effects on household savings and assets, and this was the results of found in 3 systematic reviews, which were agreeing on this finding. And other two systematic reviews look at psychosocial intervention and found that there are limited effects on increasing home and social support. They were positive, but very limited, so more evidence is needed here. Next, please.
I think we have about a minute.
Yes, I'm done. This is the last slide, just about on main implication for researchers, commissioners, and policymakers. So in terms of evidence gap maps, we noticed that there are a lot of gaps that needs to be filled in the future. So we need many more impact evaluations on most of the interventions that we look at. There are no high confidence systematic reviews that look at studies specific areas where there are also cluster of studies. And in this case, what we need to do is to look at single studies, but be careful to draw conclusion about them because they can't really be generalized across contexts, the results from single studies. When there are cluster of studies, we suggest to commission or do a mix of method systematic reviews. In terms of the methodology, and you can go on with the slides, it is feasible, we noticed that it is feasible to conduct impact evaluation in these difficult settings because we found more than 300 studies, although we also recognize that in some instances this is not possible. So other methods such as these small N studies that White and Phillips talk about based on the theory of change could be adopted. And finally, in terms of the use of the findings, commissioners and policymakers and implementers could be very interested in using the findings that we found in the 5 high confidence systematic reviews that really tell us what works and what doesn't work. And then if we are developing new policy and intervention, it could be useful to look at the existing studies to understand which are the unintended consequences, which outcomes were used, which indicators and which theory of change were used. Next, and we're done. So thank you very much. And the report was published in this May. We also have a policy brief of a few pages. The EGM is online, public goods, accessible by everyone. Thank you.
All right, we're going to continue with our rapid fire teasers. So please jot down your questions for Miriam. And I'd like to welcome up now Olga Petriniak, the Senior Director for Resilience and Food Security with Mercy Corps. As Senior Director for Strategy, Olga is a resilience specialist with 16 years experience with local and national governments, communities, and private sector in conflict management, climate change adaptation, natural resource management, market systems, good governance, and legal protection. Over to you, Olga.
Thanks so much, everybody, and great to be with all of you. So it's interesting, this session is about what resilience means in conflict settings, and I would also encourage us to ask ourselves how resilience is an appropriate framework or the right way of thinking in conflict settings. So I'm going to get at that in just a second. It was really interesting to see from the evidence gap analysis that the vast majority of research has been looking at drought or climate threats. But in recent years, we of course know that conflict and conflict-related crises are actually now the primary driver of hunger, right? The primary reason for year-on-year humanitarian outlays. And we see them as a primary driver reversing development gains. So just as quick background, as a resilience organization, Mercy Corps works across the development, humanitarian, and peace spectrum. We work in both climate and conflict change-affected environments to foster inclusive, resilient communities. And so given the kind of promising evidence of resilience building approaches in recurrent crises, right, in drought-affected settings, it was kind of a particular interest to us to test what matters and what works for resilience in conflict, and whether the resilience approach that was so effective in recurrent crises could also be used as this organizing framework to drive collective action and support alignment of humanitarian development and peace programming in conflict contexts. Sorry, next slide. I was supposed to be talking during that moment. and so whether this framework works in places where conflict shocks dominate the landscape, right? So we're talking about outbreaks of violence, displacement, market disruptions, et cetera. We looked at what are the critical sources of resilience, what are effective coping strategies, and what seem to be the transformative approaches that not just support coping, but also advance peace. Next slide, please. So through numerous studies mostly across our Africa portfolio, but some also in the Middle East, 3 main areas really emerged as critical to resilience in conflict settings. And the first one, it was clear from across the research, whether it was in DRC, South Sudan, or Nigeria, that communities and households relied on markets and social systems in the midst of conflict, even more than they did on humanitarian aid. Those social connections and their local economies were still working, and that was their primary source of coping in crisis, but also how they adapted to shifts in context and even how they were able to thrive. So these same capacities, access to markets, access to finance, social capital, still matter in conflict. But of course, we can't just accept conflict as the status quo, right? And that we want to also prevent conflict-related shocks and advance peace through transformative capacities. And so again, from evidence in Nigeria and Ethiopia, we found that it is possible to advance peace in environments even where violence is pervasive. And this requires short-term violence prevention measures, so things like conflict mediation and negotiation capacity, access to dialogue platforms, coupled with measures to kind of transform those structural drivers of conflict. So starting to build towards more inclusive governance, more inclusive economies. And then of course, this idea of this rapid real-time analysis kind of supports the right programming about that. So I wanted to take the next, hopefully I still have 5 minutes, to give just a couple of programmatic examples of how we've taken that evidence base, reapplied it into programs, and are kind of further testing these hypotheses and getting emerging evidence on whether this is working or not. So I want to bring you into Borno State in northeast Nigeria. We've heard about this. We know that the lingering effects of the insurgencies there have left communities with frayed social ties, disrupted markets and livelihoods, and ongoing threats of recruitment into extremism and violence. So in terms of a markets approach, what does it look like in a conflict setting? So for example, we partnered with Amos Farms. This is a large, innovative poultry breeder and wholesaler to facilitate poultry market development and revitalize rural livelihoods. So the pilot program supported Amos Farms to actually establish breeding units in conflict-affected areas of Borno. And then we also work with the most marginalized households, women, returnees, displaced communities to partially subsidize the cost of those new poultry breeds and inputs. And we also supported them with VSLAs, the kind of typical financial inclusion, supported social ties, et cetera. But you can see the results and the program evidence that's coming out of this. We also saw that nearly all households reinvested resources into continuing their poultry business, so they did not require further subsidies. We saw there was a 32% increase in those who had more than one income over the baseline. So this poultry program actually supported livelihood diversification beyond poultry. We saw clear benefits for nutrition, strengthening social bonds, psychosocial well-being. Next slide. I just want to emphasize that while that program was actually small, this type of approach is now being scaled across the USAID-funded Feed the Future Rural Resilience activity that works across Borno, Adamawa, Yobe, and Gobe. And we're supporting broader agro-food systems work. Now we're waiting for the impact evaluation to come out. Oh, I think it's a previous slide. Yep. Sorry. But we are seeing promising progress of resilience capacity strengthened that have persisted even through COVID. And I want to highlight here some of those key ingredients of success in terms of what seems to really work in supporting and facilitating these markets in conflict settings. First, it's to orient ourselves in terms of treating last mile households as our primary private sector partners. Remembering that those local producers, those very local traders are the critical actors we need to be partnering with. And then we facilitate vertical and horizontal linkages. We also have seen that facilitating market linkages while injecting cash responses, which came out of the evidence gap review, really supported those markets to persist through certain shocks that those areas were experiencing. So we had conflict and COVID happening at the same time. And we also see that economic activity, if it is structured inclusively, in this case across host and displaced communities, can then strengthen bonds and social connections that further facilitate or support resilience capacities. Next slide, please. So now I wanted to take you to a slightly different context, North Kivu and DRC, where we have actually intentionally integrated conflict management and addressing those structural drivers of conflict that I mentioned. So these violence prevention measures alongside market systems and food security programming. So North Kivu and DRC is an area rife with conflict along ethnic lines, between farmers and herders, between land managers and sharecroppers, multiple militia groups fighting for control of territory, you name it, it's all there. So Mercy Corps in this context partnered with and supported these peace and development communities at the village level, first on working on making them more inclusive, ensuring that they were representative of diverse interests, strengthening their capacity in dispute resolution and mediation. And importantly, these groups then served as a space for bilateral and collective negotiation around land access, because land security was so fundamental to investing in agricultural production, obviously, particularly in the conflict settings where people are disincentivized to make those investments. In parallel, we supported and facilitated broad market linkages and kind of this active focus on crop and livestock ensured attention to livelihood groups. You see a snapshot again from the impact evaluation here. I just want to, of this type of approach, this dual land governance and strengthening access to agricultural markets, I just want to highlight that importantly, it increased people's confidence in their ability to manage future shocks with a 14% difference over control group. And next slide. I have one more minute. So I'm finishing up. But I really just want to point out that we also saw these results hold up across gender groups, where we see both women and youth in the control groups having lower resilience indicators and feeling less hopeful about the future, whereas they even meet or exceed men in the indicator and treatment communities. And this idea of building confidence in the future is so critical because it creates an enabling environment for greater future investment in agricultural production and thus supporting future well-being. So in areas where people normally don't want to invest because of, conflict threats, this indicator of confidence in the future indicates that they will now productively invest in their future well-being. I had one more example that I'm going to skip.
But hold your questions, and we can you can use the other example in the discussion. And while Josh brings up Albert, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Albert Nordstrom, who leads the Global Resilience Partnership's work to advance the understanding and knowledge about resilience. He has served as the executive director of Future Earth's program on ecosystem change and society. He has a broad range of research expertise and areas of focus. I just am going to note a couple, which include work on resilience of social ecological systems, identifying weak signals of positive change, and developing the evidence base to improve and operationalize knowledge co-production in sustainability research. And Albert, over to you.
Thanks so much. I could just begin with just a quick acknowledgement to the other speakers, to Ben, Victor, Olga, Miriam, for fantastic insights, and thanks for Shada. I'm much the wiser person after these first 45 minutes. Also like to acknowledge that what I'm going to be talking about now, just 4 slides, trying to keep it on a quite broad, high level, and then maybe get into the details through the Q&A, is that the work that I'll be presenting is really a collaborative approach that the Global Resilience Partnership has been working on together with many partners, some of them in the room, like Jen and Olga, for example. So it's really the results of a collaborative effort that is also ongoing. I'd also like to flag that my colleague Sibel Kirosh, who's probably listening and has been masterminding the session behind the scenes, is also very much the brain within the GRP behind a lot of this work, so I can't take all credit for what we're presenting. So we came at this, myself being an academic and as a researcher, that have been instrumental in trying to develop the theory and the understanding around general transformations and sustainability transitions, and very much wanting to understand how those theories and how those approaches and how those knowledge could fit into the realm of peace building and in conflict areas. So it's been a great learning journey of taking our work and our knowledge and our theories from other sectors, other scales, other systems, and trying to work with these partners in these specific contexts. And peace building is in itself a huge transformative change. So it's unsurprising that we were very interested in trying to merge these different things. And there's also been a lot of discussion that international efforts for peace building in conflict-affected areas are failing. And so a lot of scholars and practitioners in that field have been arguing for the need for a local turn in peace building. So how can you understand and facilitate and open up the pathway for bottom-up and local efforts to help in peace building? However, and as has been said, we're just only now starting to scratch the surface in our understanding about what is the potential of local initiatives in triggering transformative change towards positive peace, and what is the potential for scaling these initiatives up. So that's sort of in a nutshell what we're trying to do with this project, basically to answer the question of how local initiatives, the innovations or practices or ways of doing things are contributing to transformative change towards peace building, identify what the particular features are in fostering this transformative change in fragile contexts. Do these initiatives have a potential for scaling impact, and what different types of futures in the system can arise if you nurture and scale up these initiatives? This is sort of an unpredictable looking into the crystal ball, but we're trying to work on that. So the next slide, please. So the first step of the project was to develop a framework, which might sound like, how many new frameworks do we need? But I think this is quite unique in many ways because it really is a result of decades of work from the sustainability, resilience, transformations, literature, and practice, then working together with initial representatives from some of these initiatives. Speaking of, so some of the people in this room have been instrumental to work with us to get data from the work they've been doing in the ground in conflict areas to plug into what the broader literature on transformations have been saying through interviews and data collection, and then in a co-production manner develop a framework which is sort of tweaked and sharpened to work to hone our understanding of transformative potential in these specific areas. So it's, I would say, the unique value of this framework really lies in the combination of different sources of knowledge, both academic, practitioner-based, local, formal, and ensuring that it builds on the combined insights between research and practice. So these are the criteria basically that came up as the 5 main features that are critical if we want to, in earnest, try and understand the transformative potential of local initiatives. And I think the key thing that we're always highlighting here is that it's a transformative potential. We can use this framework and it's never going to give us 100% guide in how the future will look like. But it can allow us to say that based on theory, based on evidence from past work, these are key features. If an initiative is doing most of them, well, then its transformative potential is much higher than if it wouldn't be doing any of these or ticking the box of any of these features. So the first criteria, just really quickly, is this alignment with the context and support and resources. These are the 2 first criteria. They can be considered like the sort of preconditions. These are factors external to the seed's realm of action, but that together highly influence the opportunities for these actions to develop and thrive. So in many cases, the initiative or the seed, that's what we call these initiatives, seeds of peace and resilience. So in many cases, these seeds might not be able to influence these external factors, but it's crucial for transformative potential that it can help gather an understanding of this awareness that's actively integrated into the activities developed by the seeds. And the other 3 facets or features, learning and system understanding, changes in power shifts and norms, fostering relationships and collaborations, have more to do with how the initiative or the seed itself is acting upon the context it stems itself and how it's fostering different types of agency. So that's the broad framework. We can go to the next slide. What we also kind of came out while working with these partners is, we unpacking these 5 different criteria in ways that can allow us to assess these different features in much more higher detail. So here we're unpacking the feature of support learning and systems understanding, and see on the one side, there's a set of sub-questions or criteria that are informative for transformations understanding in general, and on the other hand, a bit more specifically, some criteria which are key and specifically fine-tuned to understand transformative potential in conflict-specific areas or conflict hit areas. So it's a kind of a two-way thing. On the one side, we can learn a bit more about transformation in general. On the other side, specifically use this framework to understand the transformative potential in conflict areas. So just a few short summaries and findings have all been, coming out now that we've been assessing some of these initiatives, and I'll show you a map in the final slide. But before we get to that,
We're almost out of
for
time.
example, we're out of time. Okay. Just really quickly,
Yeah, if you want to jump
Sorry.
to the summary points.
No, exactly. So, for example, with resource and support, that specific feature, what we're finding is that transformative change can be, in many cases, enabled by critical internal or external resources, such as financial or material assets. And many local initiatives, such as the ones that we're exploring, are dependent, or at least partially, on these external resources. So that's critical. But at the same time, while these external resources might be a critical factor for enabling positive change, in many cases, they're also undermining the indigenous process. So there's always a kind of a trade-off between things happening internally that can generate transformative potential and things coming in from the outside. And this kind of framework allows practitioners and academics to really understand this kind of hairball of interactions happening that are, and sometimes confronting or sometimes enabling transformative aspects. We can go to the final slide just to kind of get a sense of, where we're getting these different data from. So basically we're working across 21 initiatives currently across 13 countries, and again, a highly collaborative project. And yeah, look forward to getting the questions. Like I said, the details can be discussed in the Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you, Albert. All right, so we've heard some rapid fire examples from Jen and Dikta, and presentations from Marian, Albert, and Olga. We're going to shorten, just because we started late, we're going to shorten our breakout sessions to 15 minutes. And just kind of looking at the size of the room, if we could maybe move into 4 different groups. For some discussion around things, I know many of you have really good examples from things you're working on, but just questions and things you'd like to discuss more with our panelists that we'll have back up here for some Q&A in 15 minutes. Does that sound all right? Okay. And thank you very much to our last 3 presenters. Hi, Albert. Are you there? All right, if you can just kind of wrap up your group discussions, and then we're going to bring all our panelists back up. So if I can ask Jen and Dikta and Marian and Olga to come up and have a seat. This will be the signal that we're shifting. You can sit in any order. And we'll have a mic at both ends to pass back. Yeah. It sounded like some really lively discussions, which is great. So we have all of our speakers back up and Albert on the line. And since it really did sound like some really good discussion, I heard maybe to be provocative from over this side of the room just a moment ago. So I really would like to just open it up and hear from the groups about some of the key questions you have or other comments or examples that you all want to share from your work and what you have seen work.
Thanks. My name is Kai. I work for Insure Resilience, a global partnership on the implementation of risk finance and insurance. We're currently looking into implementation of risk transfer products in conflict-affected situations. And so a lot of the basic conditions that we typically assume for the implementation of risk transfer don't exist in many of the fragile and conflict-affected countries. So you don't have regulated insurance markets, or you don't have a government that you can work with when you're putting up macro-level insurance. But we saw in one of the presentations, I think it was Olga, that cash transfers can actually have quite a positive effect, and that's the final outcome of a well-working insurance product is cash transfers coming to people, best case. We are quite new to the field, kind of, and we're struggling to find the right evidence to get things going. And we know that in the humanitarian space, there's some work going on forecast-based financing based on parametric models that are also used in insurance. But I wanted to ask the panel if there are any experiences where there was contact to insurance or similar risk transfer products. Think out of the box, not only of insurance as a pure financial product, but also in terms of risk management and risk sharing, can also be community-based, informal. That did work in the context of our session. And what was maybe the key learning from that?
Let's take another question and then go back to the panel to hear about different kinds of transfers, broadly speaking.
So the controversial discussion from our group came from me. I'm in a essential service organization where we're building the resilience of the organization to be able to sustain the essential service. Because can you hear me? Okay, sorry. So it's Eskom, the South African National Electricity Utility, and studying about resilience, how we apply it, how we think about it, how we strengthen the service. At some stage of the game, I was confronted with the realization that we are building resilience into the system, and then the people who contribute to that service, to the resilience of that service, used, in a way, their strength, their power, against the very ability to provide that service during national industrial action. where they undermined our ability to sustain service delivery. And that became just an acute situation that was very challenging, a recognition that it's not us providing a service, there's an us and a them in this, where bringing resilience interventions, you are empowering the ability to sustain a service, but that power can be used then to almost hijack the empowering for own interest rather than for the interest of the whole. And later it also became clear through levels of corruption that is embedded through capturing and whatever, all messy stuff, that it seems like, anyway, maybe I'm just expressing challenge around conflict that can come from a completely different context than most of you are talking about. Unintended consequences of bringing resilience that then change power dynamics. I don't know if it relates or apply.
Does anyone want to talk about experience on transfers? And then I think also on the question of the power dynamics. So, and then we'll go to Zuma. And
Is this on? I can't talk about the power dynamic, but I will talk about the risk transfer. In Syria, where we have a lending mechanism that is in that exact space you've talked about, there is no regulatory environment, and there is no insurance market. There's no financial regulatory environment. After the earthquake in northwest Syria, we followed on with our borrowers with emergency loans to help mitigate some of the damages they had experienced due to the earthquake, to enable them to then carry forward with their work and repay, so to ensure both the loan repayment for us, but also to ensure their sort of ongoing work in that space. So it was more of an emergency loan product, but it can function a little bit like an insurance product. And we're now in the process in the agricultural lending space trying to figure out what kind of risk, like literally like a week ago I was in a meeting talking about this, so it's very timely, how we can engage a risk management product bundled with our financial product, the lending services and the non-financial services that we provide, so that borrowers who experience losses, crop losses, have protection. So it's timely. I don't have evidence on that yet, but the emergency loan product went well, and we saw good outcomes.
Was that kind of pre-arranged, or did you have it already in your pocket in terms of the contingency plan, or did you make it up in the moment?
In that case, it was very much in response to the emergency.
We were just having that conversation yesterday with Kai at the table. So I think there are different risk transfer mechanisms, and it depends on obviously the hazard that you're facing, whether it's affordable, et cetera. First, I think we have to understand conflict-affected settings just really quickly as a broad spectrum, and we have to be aware of conflict in latent conflict environments and in active conflict environments, and then places where there's, all-out wars. And I would say, like in Nigeria, you can do insurance, right? And you can work even in very fragile contexts. So we're talking about a very vibrant agro-food system that's being built in areas that are essentially, highly conflict affected. The question still becomes, is that the best risk transfer mechanism? And there was actually a really interesting presentation in the People and Households group the other day that talked about, like, a lot of the informal economy not being, kind of viable in the insurance market and looking at kind of social protection for businesses to kind of support them in a shock responsive way so that they can continue to, I mean, that honestly might be the best way. I will just say that overall we've seen that, you know, access to finance and financial inclusion is foundational and possible in whatever setting you're in, right? And starting with village VSLAs even, which sounds so basic and we probably all roll our eyes because we've been talking about it for 20 years, they work. They strengthen social ties, and actually there's an internal risk transfer mechanism across the people in those groups. We find often that when you provide cash to one person in that group, they will actually use it as, you know, not leverage is maybe the wrong word, but support other people in the group with the expectation of reciprocity if something else goes wrong. So, I mean, I think looking at this from multiple angles is really critical. I'm not an insurance expert, so we have to have that conversation. Yeah.
Albert, did you want to comment on this?
I can comment. I didn't hear the gentleman in the back's question, but I could refer to the question around the power dynamics just very, very quickly. Just go back to that. I think it's a key point that is raised there. I think the simple but yet very complex answer is that you always have to have a systemic perspective when dealing with resilience. I think the question you raise is sort of related with resources and support. So if you bring in, for example, you bring in external support to foster resilience, but if you're unaware of some of the existing power dynamics or barriers to agency in place, the endogenous internal dynamics of the system, this can lead to corruption and new barriers popping up. That might not be exactly what's been happening in your case, but there's a suite of different evidence that you have trade-offs all the time when trying to foster resilience. There's evidence from many agriculture systems, rice farming systems, for example, around the world, Nepal and Spain, showing how having a very resilience focus for dealing with specific, predictable environmental fluctuations or social fluctuations builds resilience in the short term, but in the long term, you're just generating new vulnerabilities to other changes that you haven't, thought of. So power dynamics are critical, and that, going back to our framework, it's not the only one that lists power dynamics, but one of the key capacities is just this agency and power dynamics. But in general, a systemic cross-scale understanding and an understanding that trade-offs will happen when trying to foster resilience, especially resilience towards a specific type of disturbance. You just have to be aware of that and constantly be reflective and adaptive in the process. It's like a journey, Resilience building is a continual learning journey with new added bumps and traffic lights and things coming up. You just have to be constantly aware of that.
Someone's been patiently waiting, so go ahead.
Okay, hi everyone. My name is Zoma Mesfin, and I work with the USAID Ethiopia Resilience Learning Activity. And, trying to take it back to evidence. So with HDP, which comes up in my work a lot, I think one, there isn't like a common understanding of what that is. And because there aren't HDP programming, it's very hard to attribute that to to find evidence sort of lumped within that category. And I think it's really important. And my question is, what do you think is the best sort of platform to share best practices from HDP, especially when it's not categorized in a specific category within USAID programming?
Let's take another. Humanitarian development and peace. Yeah. So while you're thinking about that, should we take another question? All right, we'll go at the back.
I think, we try to hold on. Yeah, and I think in our group we were trying to see what question to ask, but I think the one that's coming up in conflicts is that the conflicts are varied and the underlying factors are major. But we wanted to know two things that really came up. One is the role of governance systems that existed there and how those systems have been either driving this conflict or have been been underlying to this. The other thing is the role of traditional systems that have been there and have been working in these systems. And we had the example of I worked in Somalia and parts of also Kenya. So example is some of the communities have traditional systems of governance that were long before, and with the coming of formal systems, they have been either trashed or buried down under this all new formality thing. So how can we, what are the main role of these groups? Because they play a critical role, as we have seen in most of these discussions.
Yeah, so the first question was just about humanitarian development and peace coherence and what evidence there is on, or best practices on what you all have seen work. And then the second was on local traditional governance structures and good practices and working within those structures.
Yeah, I can try. Is it work? Yeah? Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
Sorry. Sorry. So from on the humanitarian development evidence and your question about which is the best platform to share best practices, I think that the first question, the first point we should think about is what is like good evidence and how we should create knowledge about best practices, right? At REI, obviously, we advocate for good impact evaluation, rigorous mixed method impact evaluation, and really what we try to do is then convene all the evidence in one place. So, for example, we also have evidence gap maps about peace building. We have done one a few years ago, another one on humanitarian interventions that has been published a few months ago. So, like, if you're looking for evidence on that, I think it would be, in terms of what works and what doesn't work, I think those maps would be useful. But I'm sure that obviously there are many other platforms. Can I say one thing about the previous question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, on the one on financial mechanism. So in the map, for example, we look at financial inclusions and we look at interventions related to saving groups, microinsurance, weather index insurance, contingent credits, and actually it didn't come up much in the conflict studies, but overall in the map that was the second most studied intervention, meaning that there is a lot of evidence. So if you're looking for evidence, go and look at that. But I think that the challenge is that there isn't much in conflict settings, and that's a gap, and we need more evidence there.
Can I jump in? Go first, just really quick. Shoot, now I forgot what the questions were. I was ready to go with my HDP and governance. Thank you. Just blanked. On HDP, and I'm sort of part of the broader dialogues around this. I mean, one question that I would ask is, like, when we look at evidence for HDP, what are, like, HDP for what and so what? And I think the resilience conversation is what gave it the so what, like that we are driving towards collective impact, and the whole reason for HDP coherence is so we can advance collective impact and food security, economic opportunity, et cetera, through resilience. So I would actually argue that this is some of the best place to look for the evidence, and a lot of the resilience evidence is starting to look at, as we are doing here, that layering and integration, and things like the PREG impact evaluation are looking at, USAID's layered investments in northern Kenya and whether, the humanitarian and development portfolios they're working together are actually having an impact. Now, we got to bring the P a little bit more front and center, of course, but sorry, that's my pitch, to not divorce it from these resilience conversations. On governance, Jafar, you're absolutely right, and actually, one of the big difference about working on resilience and conflict is that we can't often rely on government for essential services and as a source of resilience capacities, right? In more stable contexts, we look at strengthening governance through formal government as a critical source of resilience, and you cannot always do that. And so that's where the informal institutions come in. Some of the examples that I gave around land were precisely fostering that local governance. We even see in displaced camps in Nigeria that also can't rely on government services. How do you support local governance that's informal between host and displaced communities to use that as a critical source of resilience and revitalize that where you can't always rely on formal governments?
Yes, thank you very much. I think I would also add to the role of traditional system, because even the local government in some of our communities are not as effective as the traditional government. By the traditional government, we mean either the chief, the traditional ruler, the women leader, the local and traditional systems. They tend to have direct control over the people much more than the government from the local government headquarters, which is removed from them, because every town has its own organizational structure. And that is why when I was in the household, the village insurance savings account that we talked about in household panel yesterday, if you want to give money to people in a community, it's better that it is given to the local authority or the traditional setting, because when a loan is given by the traditional ruler or the traditional council, they know the family, they know the children, they know the generations. So you are not likely to default on that loan. And even when you default, they are able to take land that belongs to that family. So there is likely to be less default with that kind of a loan. So what I'm saying here is that in the economies and the communities where we are working, the federal government does not have so much influence, and they are usually more removed from them. And the policing at federal level is not as effective as policing at local level. So what we do is to see how we recognize the traditional system and strengthen, if need be, to ensure that there is justice as much as possible. And that is one of the way forward. Thank you.
Have we?
Do you want to respond on this too?
Super quickly, I will. We could have a whole panel on this topic alone, I think, and it's critical. In the context of Mali, we see decentralization, really strong modes of decentralization, but not entirely, right? So decision-making goes, but finance doesn't necessarily go, control over finance. And so sometimes there's a need to work on both of those aspects at the same time so that local government can be more effective. When we work on local land use conventions or resource conventions, we're engaging through participatory processes, local communities and stakeholders from different groups, including groups who are in conflict with one another or maybe perceived competition among each other, so that we're building on those traditional systems first. And then the land use convention actually creates an agreement, a formal agreement of that informal rule system to negotiate access and negotiate, sort of how the resource is used. That can then be sort of engaged and respected by not just the local folks and the local government, but also sort of the technical services around the communities as well. And we've seen that where resource use conventions are in place that have been developed through participatory means, we see greater sustainability of the resource, we see biodiversity impacts, we see reduced conflict in those spaces. And so I think having really intentional processes that are participatory and are transparent, but that also engage the government as a stakeholder, needs to be part of the answer.
And I know I saw a couple hands from the back and this side previously.
Just representing this group, because there was lots of really nice questions. So I'm just the rapporteur. So the provocative question, or the version that is a bit more short, is: does conflict make a difference? because I was struck, for example, in Olga's presentation, that the 3 points you made, they were actually quite, universally relevant, whether there's conflict or not. A slightly more nuanced version of the question would be, at what point on the spectrum that you also referred to a moment ago, does conflict make a decisive difference in the kinds of interventions that you would want to implement? And the third version of the question, building on some of the other conversations which highlighted the need for fostering dialogue, for example, in Nigeria, between herders and farmers, assume that you can have that kind of dialogue. And again, that kind of dialogue is relevant in any kind of development initiative, engaging in communities and so on. But you can't do that when it's going to be very difficult, in my understanding, if that's Boko Haram, right? So there's some actors that you won't be able to bring around a table all that easily. So the most specific version of the question is, what do you do then when you can't bring people around the table because they're very radical, or they are? The other problem with the state is that they will resist such dialogue because they see themselves as authoritative. So they say, why should we be in dialogue with people because we are the authority?
Is there another question here? Okay.
My question is about what are the best practices based on your experience working in Nigeria, Syria, Cameroon, and so on. Some of these contexts look like the situation in Mali, for example. So what are the best practices you can advise where there is a complex conflict between farmers and others, and conflicts with the intervention of armed groups?
All right, so we'll take those two questions.
Yeah.
I'll respond super quickly and then pass the mic. I think it's a really important point. That's why we kind of distinguish in some ways between resilience in conflict versus resilience to conflict. Like when people are living in a state of insurgency, you at least have to realize that there's an opportunity, even when they're in that protracted crisis, where they can have some agency, some self-determination, and that's why these markets and social systems are really critical. You may not be able to dialogue or even prevent the conflict. In this case, and with Boko Haram, you could use a PEVE approach. We do that, preventing violent extremism, where you at least prevent recruitment, but certainly you don't dialogue with the group. But there's an important recognition that just because you cannot resolve that conflict doesn't mean you can't support people to be more resilient in that conflict setting. And I think that's an important distinction. Then in places where you can resolve, and this is what happened in Syria, right? For us, it's similarly, like where we worked through markets in a lot of places because we realized that they gave people more dignity, more self-determination. We, of course, are not going to negotiate with the regime. At the same time, I think it's important to recognize that there are other conflicts outside of that major conflict that are happening that you can prevent. You can work on host and displaced community in, conflict management mechanisms, even if you can't work on the insurgency. So not just seeing that big political conflict, but understanding how it breaks down at a more local level and realizing that there's actually quite a bit that we can do to prevent that splintering of factions. The dissolvement of community ties is really critical. There was another question, but I talked a lot.
Well, there was also just the follow-up on best practices with farmer-herder communities and conflict. Yeah? You have a lot of experience.
This is your area.
Yes, I want to say that we cannot actually talk of best practices because every conflict has their local relations and power dynamics. So the fact that we have the conflict between herders and farmers in place A, for instance, the challenge or the drivers might be different from that same crisis in another side. If I take the case of Nigeria, for example, farmer header crisis in the northern part of Nigeria, northeast, has a multi-dimensional driver. We have issues of religion being one of the drivers. We have issues of land being one of the drivers, and we have climate change being there, and then of course the armed insurgents. But in the southern part, which we also have a farmer header crisis, the drivers is more land and maybe a trespass of farmers' land, farmers' farms. And so in the south, it's basically the religious color is not there, because the south is mostly Christian, and so the herders that came down to graze their cattle are more or less tenants to the owners. So when there's a tenancy landlord dispute, it's a little bit easier than the one in the north. So what I'm saying is that we cannot come out with a best practice. However, we think that in all cases, the resilience and survival of both parties should be paramount. How do we make sure that the conflicts do not escalate and there's no complete breakdown? How do we minimize the losses either for the farmer or the herder? And as much as possible, using local solutions. We have maybe chiefs in council, we have the oldest men, we have women. Women are beginning to play a very key role in peacekeeping, because the women are able to, when the women are convinced, they're able to talk to the men who are the ones carrying arms in most cases, because we don't have a lot of women carrying arms as at now. So the women are quite, if we engage the women to see the reason why they talk to their sons and their husbands to stay out of battle, it's usually a way out. So what I'm saying is that let us, the thing we can say is do as much as we can within our own safety, within the space to minimize losses and escalating the conflict, while we manage the conflict, as well as see how we can mitigate those who have suffered some kind of loss, like giving them some credit to be able to reestablish farms, or giving irrigation or drinkers. For instance, we have in the south, we have been able to provide, under another study that we did for IDRC, we were able to help provide water drinking places for cattle, so they don't need to go too far, crossing farms to the river to drink water. But water is now being given to them in some of the settlements that they now have down south. So I think, I hope I've made some sense.
You have. Okay, so yes, we'll go here, and then do we have time for another question after?
Christine, can I?
Okay.
Christine, when she's done, can I just say one thing in response to? Okay.
Sure. So, really quickly, just to add, I am the Feed the Future coordinator in Nigeria, and I also am the AOR for the Rural Resilience Activity. So I wanted to add, just from the perspective of being there and experiencing. So in terms, I want to respond to a lot, but I'm going to respond to best practices. So I want to add on to what you were saying, some best practice that the Rural Resilience Activity has done that have been very effective. And not only just the rural resilience, we had actually 4 activities in the Northeast that were doing really, really well and making substantial change, especially with the IDPs, internally displaced people. One of those things was social cohesiveness. I feel like it was on the tip of everybody's tongue because it was said, but it wasn't. that is like the foundation of a lot of the activities that we do, is to make sure that people are allowing other people to integrate into those communities as they move, because a lot of the displaced people, their homes might become safe at a certain point, but they don't want to return just because they're still not able to really effectively live. Like, they can't go to their farms, it's still not safe there. So some of them just move to those new areas, and by doing the social cohesive portion, the community starts to welcome them into those communities and allow them, I mean, they become community members. And so that's been one aspect that's worked very well. Two other things that work very well. The next thing, the Real Resilience activity did a financial dialogue with banking institutions. This dialogue they brought about maybe 7 to 10 financial institutions to Abuja, which is the capital. They sat down and had a dialogue about the importance of them investing in the smallholder farmers in the Northeast. It was very intensive dialogue. They gave great examples how the farmers will be paying back the funds and how they are backed and supported by the program. But they didn't need to be, because the VSLAs, they were able to show how effective those were going and how everything is going very well. That day, they had 2 banks give large sums of money to be set aside for the farmers to get access for like microloans for those funds. And since then, that has grown to many other banks being willing to invest in that community. Last one, because I want to go quickly. I want to touch on the transfers. The cash transfers, they do work, but it cannot be on a regular basis. I think it can't be a consistent, okay, we're just going to give cash transfers because COVID, we're going to give cash transfers because Ukraine, Russia. It's not going to give you sustained, improved livelihoods. However, it does help them with the effects, especially for COVID. We definitely did those cash transfers. It made a substantial change for all the Feed the Future activities within Nigeria. However, when we looked at it from the next time that we did it, we were like, this time maybe we'll do inputs. Instead of them just getting the cash, maybe give them seeds, improve seeds, give them access to fertilizer. Fertilizer is like 4 to 5 times more of the price what it usually is in Nigeria at this time. So giving them access to those inputs so they still can produce what they would have normally produced. In addition, last thing is they highly encourage them to invest in insurance. And that, that's not a norm for smallholder farmers. It's an unnecessary expense that a lot of them cannot afford. However, in the long run, it really did work out this year because they had these abnormal flooding throughout Nigeria. And since most of the farmers did invest in insurance, they were able to get payback for some of their crops. So thank you.
I will be really fast, but Ralph asked the question of kind of so what about conflict, because it sounds a lot like you're just maybe doing development, if I could boil down what you said. My paraphrasing. But I think that's exactly the point. Markets are functioning in conflict places. Social dynamics are functioning. People are living their lives. And so doing this kind of programming really is using resilience building as a vehicle for, first of all, ensuring that those systems continue and people are able to have self-reliance and safety and all of the pieces, but also using that as a vehicle for cooperation in some cases in a way that can actually bring people together and build social cohesion and rebuild relationships of trust. What are market systems? They're economic relationships. Who are they between? People, right? So the conflict happens and the work is about keeping things moving in the right direction and addressing some of those drivers in a way that can actually help recovery, not to the baseline, but in a resilience mindset towards transformative change that mitigates against the conflict recurring.
And
motivated by the self-interest of the participants who may not talk to each other otherwise.
yeah, and I think that was borne out in many of the examples here. And the DRC example that Olga raised, that was women speaking up from conflicting groups that really made all of that happen, both on the economic side as well as on the peace building and peace mitigation side. And I think across all these examples, while it didn't come out quite as strongly as I thought it might, there really is a very important role for women in these things. And I just want to thank Jasmine and Jen for doing a great job for me of doing some good summary comments. I do think just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, there's so many dimensions to this. One, I really think on the humanitarian development, peace, kind of coherence, what are we doing in this? As was noted, resilience provides the so what to that conversation. I also think we have those words backwards. And we should be putting peace at the front of that and thinking about how does my humanitarian intervention, whatever it is, how can it help to bring in peace? And the same thing for our development investments. How does my intervention help build trust, whether it's with the government, whether it's between communities? I think that's really important. And sometimes the best interventions are not the newest thing. We have been talking about village savings and loans and different names and things. There are a whole set of financial tools, some as simple as village saving and loans, some much more complex that we've heard about throughout this forum. But they are available and they do work even in fragile and conflict-affected settings. And they really do build social cohesion. And a lot of that cohesion, even when populations are displaced, people take with them. They're often moving together. So that social bonding is really critical and such an important part of the programming. And I think throughout all of the examples we heard today. One last plug. All of the slides and things will be available. There are also a number of resources that will be available linked to this session. USAID has a number of toolkits for conflict and food security, conflict and water security, and there's other studies and things from our panelists from Spark on pastoral communities that will also link. And I know many of you have such rich experience in this room, so if you have studies and best practices, please do share them in the resource library for this forum as well, so that we can all continue to learn from each other. Thank you so much.